The courthouse buzzed with quiet tension, the kind that comes when two strangers stand at the center of a storm they never saw coming. Judge Henry Calloway was a man of order, known for his strict demeanor and no-nonsense rulings. His courtroom was his kingdom, and he presided with an iron gavel. His reputation was clear. He treated every case as a puzzle to solve, each person a piece to fit into his view of justice. But today, something about this particular case unsettled him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Across the room stood Marcia Carter, a composed, self-assured woman with a quiet confidence that turned heads. Her caramel brown eyes didn't waver, even under the weight of Judge Calloway's sharp gaze. Marcia was no stranger to adversity. She built her career on being a voice for the voiceless, a relentless advocate for justice. But today wasn't just any day. Today, she wasn't here as a lawyer. She was here as a defendant, accused of something she hadn't expected: contempt of court in a prior proceeding. The case seemed cut and dry on the surface. Judge Calloway, flipping through the case file, noted the charges against her. The law was clear, and to him, this was just another day on the bench. As he looked up at Marcia, standing firm in her resolve, something about her stirred a vague sense of familiarity. He shook it off. He couldn't afford distractions. Justice had to be served, after all. The tension in the room was palpable as the proceedings began. Marcia wasn't the type to back down easily. When asked to explain herself, she spoke with a calm yet unyielding tone, detailing her actions and why she believed she was being unjustly accused. Her argument was compelling, precise, and laced with integrity. Yet, the judge's expression remained unreadable, his years of experience hiding whatever might have been bubbling beneath the surface. But as Marcia spoke, something strange began to happen. Judge Calloway's stern expression faltered for a fleeting moment. There was something about her voice, a conviction, that sparked a faint, almost forgotten memory. He couldn't place it, but it gnawed at him, even as he tried to maintain focus. The courtroom fell silent as the judge prepared to deliver his verdict. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the gavel to fall. But just before he could speak, Marcia said something that stopped him cold. "Your Honor, before you pass judgment, I'd like to submit one last piece of evidence. It's about your family." The words hum in the air like a thunderclap. Judge Calloway blinked, his composure slipping for the first time. His family. What could this woman possibly know about his family? He stared at her, trying to mask the sudden wave of unease that swept over him. Marcia reached into her briefcase and pulled out a document, her hands steady despite the weight of the moment. She walked forward, placing the paper on the bench before stepping back. "I believe this will explain everything," she said softly. The judge hesitated, his fingers hovering over the document. The courtroom seemed to shrink around him as he picked up the paper and began to read. His eyes scanned the words, his expression darkening with every line. And then, as if struck by a bolt of lightning, he froze. His hand trembled slightly as he lowered the paper. His eyes met Marcia's, and for the first time that day, the walls around his heart cracked. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the spectators tried to decipher what had just happened. But Judge Calloway said nothing. Instead, he sat there, a storm brewing in his mind, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him like never before. Who was this woman? And how could she hold the key to something so deeply personal, so undeniably tied to his own life? The answer, it seemed, would change everything for both of them. Judge Calloway leaned back in his chair, his usually steady demeanor now visibly shaken. He felt the weight of the document in his hand, as though it were heavier than it should have been. His eyes flickered back to Marcia, who stood calm yet resolute. There was no trace of bloating in her expression, only a quiet confidence that she knew something he did not. Something about her unnerved him, but it wasn't fear. It was familiarity. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure, but the words didn't come as easily as they usually did. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice carrying a slight tremor, "this document. I don't understand how it pertains to this case." Marcia's lips curved into a faint smile, not of satisfaction, but of understanding. "Your Honor," she replied, her voice measured and steady, I believe if you look at it closely, you'll find it pertains to much more than this case. It pertains to your life." Her words sent another ripple through the room, and the gallery's whispers grew louder until the judge rapped his gavel. "Order!" he barked, his voice returning to its usual commanding tone. But inside, his thoughts raced. He scanned the document again, hoping for a clue, a way to dismiss whatever game she was playing. Yet, the more he read, the more the pieces started to fit together in a way that made him feel exposed, vulnerable. The document detailed information about a woman named Lillian Thompson, someone Judge Calloway hadn't thought about in decades. Lillian was his family's housekeeper when he was a child, a warm and kind woman who had practically raised him and his siblings while his parents were consumed with their careers. But why was her name here now in his courtroom? "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice low but firm, masking the unease creeping into his chest. Marcia tilted her head slightly. "I had to do some digging. It wasn't easy, but I found what I needed. You see, Your Honor, Lillian Thompson was more than just your housekeeper. She was also my grandmother." The air seemed to leave the room as her words hum in the silence. Judge Calloway's mind reeled, struggling to process what she had just said. Lillian's face flashed in his memory, a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, always humming as she worked. Could it be true? Could this poised, confident woman standing before him be connected to the woman who had meant so much to his family, yet had been taken for granted in so many ways? "I don't see how this is relevant," he said, his voice clipped, his defenses rising. "This court isn't here to entertain personal histories." Marcia nodded slightly, as if she expected that reaction. "You're right, Your Honor. But sometimes personal history is exactly what justice requires." Her words struck a nerve. For years, Judge Calloway had built his career on the idea of impartiality, of keeping personal matters separate from the law. But now, standing in front of him was a woman who seemed determined to blur that line. And worse, she was doing it with a grace and conviction that he couldn't ignore. The courtroom remained tense as Marcia continued, her voice calm but unwavering. "My grandmother worked for your family for years, but her story wasn't one of simple employment. She gave everything she had to raise your family, even as she sacrificed time with her own. And yet, when she passed away, it was as though she never existed in your lives. No acknowledgement, no gratitude." Judge Calloway's face tightened, the words stinging more than he cared to admit. He wanted to argue, to deny it, but a part of him knew there was truth in what she said. He remembered how, as a child, he had taken Lillian's presence for granted, never questioning why she was always there, always giving. But he also remembered the day she left, how sudden it was, how quiet the goodbye had been. His parents had brushed it off, telling him not to dwell on it. And he hadn't. Until now. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice sharper now, trying to regain control of the situation. "This is a courtroom, not a family reunion. If you have a point to make, I suggest you make it." Marcia's eyes flashed with determination. "The point, Your Honor, is that justice isn't always about what's written in the law. Sometimes it's about confronting the past, about recognizing the debts we owe, even when we'd rather forget them." Her words sent a chill down his spine. He couldn't deny the weight of what she was saying, but he also couldn't let her derail the case. He had a duty to uphold the law, and personal history couldn't change that, or could it? The gallery watched in rapt silence as the tension between the judge and the defendant deepened. It was clear to everyone in the room that this was no ordinary case. There was a connection here, one that neither party could fully ignore. As the judge looked at Marcia, he felt the walls he had built around himself beginning to crack. He wanted to dismiss her words, to focus solely on the facts of the case. But the truth was, he couldn't. Not anymore. The document in his hands wasn't just a piece of evidence. It was a mirror, forcing him to confront parts of himself he'd long buried. And standing before him was a woman who seemed to know more about his life, his family, than he had ever cared to acknowledge. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. But Judge Calloway couldn't focus on the crowd or even the case at hand. His mind was spinning, caught between the demands of justice and the weight of a history he could no longer ignore. And as he looked at Marcia once more, he realized this wasn't just a trial. It was a reckoning. The courtroom was electric, with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. Judge Calloway's grip on his gavel tightened as he fought to steady his emotions. He had spent decades ensuring that personal matters never interfered with his role as an arbiter of justice. But now, standing in front of him was Marcia Carter, a woman who had managed to pull the ghosts of his past into the sterile order of his courtroom. Marcia's calm demeanor didn't waver, but there was a flicker of something deeper in her eyes. Resolve, maybe even a hint of sorrow. She wasn't here just to prove the point. She was here for something more profound. Judge Calloway couldn't decide if it was justice, vindication, or something else entirely. "I understand this is difficult," Marcia said, breaking the silence that had stretched thin across the room. "But you have to know, Your Honor, I'm not here to attack you. I'm here because this moment, it's bigger than both of us." Her words made his chest tighten. For all his training and experience, he wasn't prepared for confrontation like this. Personal, layered, and impossible to categorize within the neat confines of the law. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, waiting for his next move. But what could he say? That he had no idea how to process what was happening. "Miss Carter," he finally managed, his voice softer now, "if you think bringing up my family's history changes the facts of this case, you're mistaken. The law doesn't bend for personal grievances." Marcia nodded, as though she'd anticipated his response. "The law doesn't bend," she agreed, "but people can. Sometimes they have to." The gallery stirred again, and Judge Calloway cast a sharp glance at the crowd, silencing them instantly. But even as he tried to project authority, he'd felt the ground shifting beneath him. Marcia's words echoed in his mind, digging into places he hadn't examined in years. As the proceedings continued, Marcia began to unravel a story that neither the judge nor the courtroom had been prepared for. She spoke of her grandmother, Lillian Thompson, not as a housekeeper, but as a woman of extraordinary resilience. Lillian, she explained, had cared for the Calloway family through years of hardship, all while raising her own children from a distance. She had poured everything into their home, ensuring that Henry and his siblings had the stability and care their parents often neglected to provide. Judge Calloway's jaw clenched as she spoke, memories surfacing despite his efforts to suppress them. He remembered Lillian's gentle scolding when he didn't eat his vegetables, the way she hummed lullabies as she folded laundry, her unwavering presence during his mother's frequent absences. But he also remembered the way his family had treated her, kind perhaps, but distant. Always employer and employee, never quite equals. Marcia's voice grew firmer as she described the sacrifices Lillian had made. The courtroom listened intently as she painted a picture of a woman who had given everything and received little in return. And as Marcia's story unfolded, the focus shifted from Judge Calloway's role in this case to something much larger, the silent injustices that often go unnoticed but leave lasting scars. But Marcia wasn't done. She spoke of her own childhood, growing up in a home where Lillian's absence was deeply felt. She described the stories her grandmother had shared, stories of a young Henry Calloway and his siblings, stories that had shaped her understanding of privilege and resilience. And then she revealed something that sent another ripple through the courtroom. "When my grandmother passed," Marcia said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion, "your family never reached out. Not a card, not a word. She had given her life to you, and when she was gone, it was as though she had never existed." Judge Calloway felt a pang of guilt he hadn't expected. He remembered his mother mentioning Lillian's passing in passing, as though it were a footnote in their lives. He hadn't thought much of it then, but now, hearing Marcia's words, it felt like a wound he hadn't realized he carried. The gallery shifted uncomfortably, the weight of Marcia's words settling over the room. Judge Calloway knew he couldn't let this derail the case, but he also knew he couldn't ignore it. He leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Marcia. "You've made your point," he said, his voice low. "But this court deals in facts, not feelings. If you have something tangible to present, now is the time." Marcia took a deep breath, as though she had been waiting for this moment. "Your Honor," she said, her tone deliberate, "the facts are that my grandmother's story is not unique. It's the story of countless others who have been overlooked, undervalued, and forgotten. And it's time for those stories to be acknowledged." Her words hung in the air, a challenge that Judge Calloway couldn't easily dismiss. He wanted to argue, to remind her that the courtroom wasn't the place for personal crusades. But deep down, he knew there was truth in what she was saying. The law might be blind, but justice wasn't. And sometimes, justice required seeing things that had been hidden for far too long. The courtroom remained silent, the tension thick and unyielding. Judge Calloway's mind raced as he tried to find a way to regain control of the situation. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that Marcia wasn't just speaking to him. She was speaking to everyone in the room, perhaps even to a larger audience beyond the courthouse walls. And as he sat there, grappling with the weight of her words, he realized that this case was no longer just about the charges against Marcia Carter. It was about something much bigger. Something that had been buried for years, but was now impossible to ignore. The conflict was far from resolved, and the tension only continued to build. But one thing was clear. This was no ordinary trial, and the stakes were higher than anyone could have anticipated. The silence in the courtroom grew heavier, as though the air itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Judge Calloway, usually so composed, sat stiffly in his chair. His mind raced, thoughts colliding with memories he hadn't summoned in years. Every word Marcia spoke had carved deeper into the walls he'd built around himself, walls he had thought were impenetrable. But now, with the weight of her accusations and the echoes of a past he couldn't ignore, those walls felt dangerously close to crumbling. Marcia stood steady, her gaze never leaving his. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the internal battle he was trying so hard to hide. It wasn't just about the case anymore. This was about the truth, a truth that had gone unspoken for too long. But even as she pressed forward, she couldn't help but feel the enormity of the moment. She was standing in a room full of strangers, bearing pieces of her family's history, knowing that the man in front of her held the power to shape how that story would end. "Your Honor," she said after a long pause, her voice cutting through the silence, "I know this isn't an easy thing to hear, and it's not an easy thing for me to say, but ignoring the past doesn't make it disappear. It only lets the wounds fester." Judge Calloway's jaw tightened, his gaze dropping momentarily to the gavel in his hand. He wanted to dismiss her words, to tell her they were irrelevant, that the courtroom was no place for personal reckonings. But the truth was, he couldn't. Not now. Not when her words were peeling back layers he had buried under years of professional decorum and detachment. He looked back up at her, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. "This court isn't here to settle personal grievances, Miss Carter. If you have evidence that pertains to the charges, present it. Otherwise, this discussion is over." Marcia didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her briefcase once more, pulling out a stack of old photographs. She held them up for the court to see before walking them over to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. The images were faded, their edges worn, but the faces in them were unmistakable. Lillian Thompson stood in the center of most of them, her warm smile radiating even through the black and white grain of the photos. But what caught Judge Calloway's eye was the little boy standing beside her in several of the pictures, a boy with wide eyes and a shy smile. It was him. His breath caught as he flipped through the images. Each one was a snapshot of moments he had long forgotten. Lillian tying his shoelaces before school, teaching him how to bake in the kitchen, holding his hand at a park. They weren't just pictures. They were fragments of a childhood that now felt both distant and painfully close. The gallery leaned forward in their seats, sensing the shift in the room. Even the attorneys on either side of the courtroom seemed momentarily lost in the weight of the moment. Marcia spoke again, her voice steady, but tinged with emotion. "These aren't just photographs," she said. "They're proof. Proof of who my grandmother was. Proof of what she gave to your family. And proof that she mattered." Judge Calloway's throat felt tight. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything, to regain control of the situation. But no words came. Instead, he stared at the images, the memories rushing back like a flood he couldn't stop. Marcia stepped closer, her tone softer now, but no less resolute. You once said that justice is about facts, Your Honor. And the facts are that my grandmother gave everything she had to you and your family. But when she needed support, when she needed acknowledgement, she got nothing in return. That's not justice. That's neglect. The tension in the room was almost unbearable now. Judge Calloway's hand trembled slightly as he placed the photographs down on the bench. His mind raced, searching for a way to respond without betraying the storm of emotions inside him. But before he could speak, Marcia continued, her voice growing stronger. This isn't just about my grandmother, she said. It's about the countless others like her, the ones who give everything and receive so little. And it's about recognizing that sometimes the law alone isn't enough. Sometimes we have to confront the human cost of our decisions. Her words struck a chord that reverberated through the courtroom. The gallery was utterly still now, every eye fixed on the judge. Even the sound of the ceiling fan seemed muted, as though the room itself was holding its breath. Judge Calloway felt his chest tighten as Marcia's words hit home. He thought about his years on the bench, the countless rulings he had made, each one weighed carefully against the law. But in this moment, the law felt insufficient. How could it account for the sacrifices Lillian had made, for the way her absence had shaped the woman standing before him now? He cleared his throat, his voice betraying the struggle within. Miss Carter, you've made your case very personal. But this court can't operate on emotion alone. If you want justice, you'll have to convince me with evidence. Marcia stepped back, her expression calm but determined. I believe I already have, Your Honor, she said. Now it's up to you to decide what to do with it. The courtroom buzzed faintly as her words settled over the room. Judge Calloway sat frozen, his mind torn between the rigid structure of the law and the undeniable truth of what he had just seen and heard. The gavel felt heavy in his hand, a symbol of authority that now seemed almost meaningless. He glanced at Marcia one more time, her gaze unwavering. In that moment, he realized that this wasn't just a trial. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for him, but for everything he stood for. And as the tension reached its peak, he knew that whatever decision he made next would change everything, for Marcia, for himself, and for the legacy of the woman who had brought them both to this point. The tension in the courtroom was nearly unbearable, the air thick with the weight of unspoken truths and unresolved conflicts. Judge Calloway stared at Marcia, her words echoing in his mind as if they had been etched there. The photographs on the bench seemed to radiate a quiet accusation, their faded edges telling stories of care, sacrifice, and a connection he had tried so hard to forget. He reached for his gavel, his fingers brushing the worn wood, but he couldn't bring himself to raise it. Something about Marcia's presence, her unwavering gaze, made it impossible to dismiss this moment. It wasn't just the story she was telling. It was the way it seemed to weave through his life, tying together threads he hadn't even known were loose. But before he could speak, Marcia moved closer, her voice cutting through the silence. Your Honor, she said, her tone calm, but carrying a new weight, there's something else you need to know. Something that changes everything. The gallery held its collective breath, the room charged with anticipation. Even Judge Calloway, for all his attempts to maintain composure, felt a jolt of unease. Marcia reached into her briefcase again, this time pulling out a single folded letter. Its edges were worn, the paper yellowed with age, but the way she held it suggested it was far more than just another piece of evidence. This letter, she said, unfolding it carefully, was written by my grandmother. She wrote it shortly before she passed, and it was addressed to your mother. Judge Calloway's heart sank. He hadn't expected this, hadn't even considered that such a letter could exist. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, as Marcia handed the letter to the bailiff, who brought it to him. His hands trembled as he took it, the weight of the envelope far heavier than it had any right to be. As he opened it, the courtroom fell into a silence so deep it felt like the world outside had ceased to exist. The judge's eyes scanned the words, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock, then something much deeper, something close to sorrow. The letter was short but devastatingly clear. In it, Lillian had poured out her heart, expressing her love for the Calloway family, but also her pain at how she had been treated in the end. She spoke of sacrifices she had made, opportunities she had given up, and the deep hurt of being dismissed without so much as a proper goodbye. But what caught Judge Calloway's attention most was the final paragraph, a revelation that sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't just a goodbye letter, it was a confession. Marcia watched his reaction closely, her own heart pounding as she waited for him to speak. The gallery remained eerily quiet, the tension so thick it felt almost suffocating. Finally, Judge Calloway placed the letter down, his face pale, his eyes clouded with something Marcia couldn't quite place. This can't be true," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Marcia stepped forward, her expression softening just slightly. "I know it's hard to believe, Your Honor, but it's the truth. My grandmother and your father, they had a relationship, and from that relationship, a child was born." The gallery erupted into gasps and murmurs, the shock rippling through the room like a tidal wave. Judge Calloway's grip tightened on the edge of his bench, his mind spinning as he tried to process what she was saying. A child? His father and Lillian. It was unthinkable. And yet, as the pieces fell into place, he realized the signs had been there all along, hidden in the periphery of his memory. He looked back at Marcia, his voice trembling as he asked the question he already knew the answer to. Who was the child? Marcia's gaze didn't waver. "My mother," she said softly. "Which makes us family, Your Honor." The words hit him like a physical blow. Family. The very idea seemed impossible, and yet, as he looked at Marcia, he couldn't deny the resemblance he had ignored until now. The same determined eyes, the same sharp features. She wasn't just a stranger standing in his courtroom. She was a piece of his family's legacy, a living reminder of a truth they had buried. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, the revelation too big to contain. Judge Calloway leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. If what Marcia said was true, it meant his entire understanding of his family, his history, had been built on foundation of omission and denial. It meant that his life, his choices, had been shaped by secrets he had never even known existed. And yet, as the shock settled, a new emotion began to take its place, fear. Because if Marcia was right, it wasn't just his past that was at stake. It was his career, his reputation, everything he had spent his life building. The implications were staggering, and for the first time in his career, he felt truly powerless. Marcia, sensing the shift in the room, stepped back, her demeanor calm but resolute. She had done what she came to do. She had laid the truth bare, no matter how uncomfortable or disruptive it might be. Now, it was up to the judge to decide what to do with it. But as Judge Calloway sat there, the letter still trembling in his hands, he realized that the decision wasn't just about the case. It was about his own identity, his own sense of justice. And as the weight of it all bore down on him, he couldn't shake the feeling that this trial, this moment, would change everything, not just for Marcia, but for him as well. The room was so quiet now that the creak of the judge's chair as he shifted felt deafening. Judge Calloway's eyes moved from the letter in his hands to Marcia standing before him. Her steady gaze held no malice, no triumph, only an unwavering determination. This was not a moment of revenge for her. It was something deeper, something about truth, justice, and the legacy of a woman who had been overlooked for too long. The judge set the letter down carefully, his fingers lingering on its edges as though letting go of it would make the revelation less real. His voice, when he spoke, was quieter than anyone in the room had ever heard. "You're telling me my father knew about this?" "Knew about her, and said nothing." Marcia nodded. "He knew," she said softly, "but he chose to hide it. Whether it was shame, fear, or something else, I can't say. But the truth was there in plain sight, and now it's here for everyone to see." The words hit Judge Calloway harder than he thought possible. He could feel the weight of the courtroom's eyes on him, their collective judgment burning into his skin. He had spent his entire career upholding the law, priding himself on his impartiality and strength. And yet, In this moment, he felt as though the ground beneath him had given way entirely. "I need a moment," he said abruptly, his voice sharp as he stood. Without waiting for a response, he turned and disappeared through the door to his chambers, leaving the courtroom buzzing with whispers. Marcia stood frozen, unsure of what his sudden departure meant. The gallery exchanged confused glances, their anticipation rising as they waited for what would come next. Inside his chambers, Judge Calloway leaned against the desk, his hands gripping its edge as he stared at the floor. The memories came rushing back now. Lillian's face, her laugh, her presence that had been a constant in his childhood. He had adored her, even if he had never said it aloud. But now, knowing what he did, that adoration felt tainted by guilt. She had been more than just a caregiver. She had been family, and he had failed her in every way that mattered. The door to his chambers creaked open, and his clerk peeked in hesitantly. "Your Honor, they're waiting," she said softly. He nodded, taking a deep breath before straightening his robe and returning to the bench. The room fell silent as he entered, the tension palpable. He took his seat, his expression unreadable as he looked down at Marcia. "This has been an unusual case," he began, his voice measured, but carrying a weight that silenced the last murmurs in the gallery. "The law is clear, but so is the truth. And the truth is that this court has been forced to confront not just a case, but a history. One that is uncomfortable, painful, and deeply personal." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room before settling on Marcia. "Miss Carter, you have brought forward evidence that cannot be ignored. Evidence that speaks not just to the facts of this case, but to the legacy of someone who gave her life in service to others. And while the law may not always address such truths, this court must." The gallery leaned forward, hanging on his every word. Marcia's breath caught, her heart pounding as she waited for the decision. Judge Calloway continued, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "In light of the evidence presented, the charges against Miss Carter are dismissed. Furthermore, I will be issuing an order to review this court's handling of similar cases, to ensure that justice is not just a word we use, but a principle we uphold." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but he wasn't finished. He turned to Marcia once more, his expression softening. "Miss Carter, your grandmother deserved better from my family. And from me, I cannot change the past, but I can ensure that her story is heard and her legacy honored." The finality of his words should have been the end, but as the crowd began to stir, a figure in the back of the gallery stood up. It was an elderly man, his face weathered, but his presence commanding. All eyes turned to him as he stepped forward, clutching a folder tightly in his hands. "Your Honor," the man said, his voice gravelly but firm, "I have something to add." The judge frowned, the interruption unexpected. "Who are you?" he asked. The man hesitated, then squared his shoulders. "My name is Walter Thompson. Lillian was my sister." The gallery gasped, the tension in the room skyrocketing once more. Marcia turned, her expression one of shock and confusion. Walter continued, his voice trembling slightly. "She didn't just write one letter, Your Honor," he said, holding up the folder. "She wrote several, letters she never sent, and they tell a story that hasn't been told yet. A story about promises made and broken." Judge Calloway motioned for the bailiff to take the folder, his heart pounding as he flipped through its contents. The letters were filled with more details, more confessions, including one that changed everything yet again. Lillian had left behind not just one child, but two. The second had been placed for adoption in secret, her identity unknown. Until now. The revelation sent shockwaves through the room. The truth had not only connected Marcia and Judge Calloway, but had opened a new chapter in a story that refused to stay buried. And as the judge sat there, the weight of his family's secrets pressing down on him, he realized that the truth, no matter how painful, had a way of finding its way to the surface.